I recall listening to a podcast, I believe, with a host called the Atheist guy, and he had Bart Ehrman on. And Bart Ehrman is an atheist, really kind of an agnostic, and he's a legitimate biblical scholar. And on the radio program, the atheist guy actually said to Bart Ehrman, well, we know not only the Bible's not reliable, but Jesus didn't really exist, so we have no good evidence that Jesus actually existed. And Bart Ehrman, a fellow skeptic or atheist, said, no, that's too far. We have tons of evidence Jesus existed. It's like, yeah, I know, but the Jesus that we think about nowadays, that's not the same. It's like, no, there's great evidence that there is a Jesus and that he was very similar to what we have today. There are some changes, and so all this. What was happening was one skeptic was making a broad, sweeping statement that another skeptic was saying, hold on a second, you're going too far, man. But see, there's a difference between being a skeptic and being a cynic. A true skeptic is someone who doesn't believe until there's enough evidence. A cynic is somebody who won't believe even when there is. And for the longest time, I was a cynic when it came to the Bible. I came from a Muslim background where the Quran was God's word and the Bible was not. But then I began to see when my mind was changed from cynicism to skepticism, that led me on a path to belief, actually, because true skepticism looks for answers. Cynicism debunks answers. And I think oftentimes you find challenges to the Bible that are unyielding, not because someone's interested in the evidence, it's because they're interested in an agenda.
You know what we're about to do? We're about to get real. We're about to have conversations that Christians have behind closed doors. The scary ones, the ones that make you feel uncomfortable. That's where we're going. Why? Because we're family. Ustedes son mi familia.
So this is the Brian and Janelle podcast. She's Janelle and I'm Brian. If you don't want to miss anything, all you have to do is just hit that subscribe button to get a notification whenever we drop a new episode. This is the Brian and Janelle podcast. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready, Brian.
He's big time.
He is big time.
And
but he's
like
our friend.
A black belt in like mixed something that's going to just take you down. And he's the North American director with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. His latest book, Saving Truth, Finding Meaning and Clarity. Thanks for coming back on the show, Abdu Murray.
It's great to be on, guys. Thanks for having me.
So just to establish your superior taste in art as well as in apologetics, if you were to choose between like a romantic comedy and a superhero movie, what would you choose?
It would obviously be a romantic comedy superhero movie.
That's right.
Really?
No, of course not.
Oh, no, I was so disappointed. I was like, oh, it's all ruined.
No. Although, you do some of the better superhero movies do have bits of romance and comedy in them. So, the appeal is they have something for everybody. So, everyone can be satisfied.
Yeah, I can look at Sarah and go, see, there was kissing and like love in this. It's Spider-Man's good.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. The Spider-Man thing had to give it. My daughters loved Spider-Man movie.
Oh, my kids loved it too. And one of the reasons I geek out about this around you is because I know people have these misconceptions about theologians and scholars, right? Like when we have our theologian friends on the show, I know people picture them sitting around in a smoky room with books debating theology. And you're not always, you love apologetics and Jesus, but you also love a good movie now and again. You're a very normal guy.
I do indeed. And it's funny, people always ask, like, what do you guys get together at RGIM and you have your meetings? What do you guys talk about? And there's times when we talk about very, very deep things. And then the other day, I was with the team in Nova Scotia doing some events there, and we talked about beekeeping and beehives and the way the females kick the males out in the winter and kill them because they're useless, which I thought was just funny. But anyway, that's what we talk about.
See, I love it. Now, I know you go all over the world and you hear interesting questions from people, but even once I had a conversation in a podcast recording with a guy called Ryan the Agnostic, and he just in passing was just like, yeah, the Bible, you can't trust that. It's been written for thousands of years. So why is there this pervasive idea that the Bible is untrustworthy?
Well, it's interesting because the pervasive idea really started back when there was a thing called form criticism and the German school of thought that took the Bible and said, we're going to deconstruct this thing and try to create some theories on why we can't trust it. But before that, it was basically assumed it was trustworthy. And then there was a movement to say, you know what, we can criticize this thing and think about things a little bit more critically and all this. And people thought that they were going to be able to debunk it. The good news is that when you actually take that attitude of, I'm going to debunk this thing and I'm going to take it seriously enough to debunk the world's most influential book, and it still remains that. What happens to a lot of people is what happened to me. I walked out of my desire to debunk the Bible, ending up trusting it as the sole document for rule and faith for myself. I didn't start off very, very positive about the Bible either, but ended up becoming, hopefully, one of its spokesperson for it. Because I think it is worth believing and it is worth trusting on a number of levels, not just its accuracy, but so many of the things, its existential issues, the ways it actually not only just tells us what actually happened in the ancient history, but how that ancient history and God's movement through it affects our lives today. It can be relevant in every single way. No other book does that. A lot of books have timeless messages, but one book has 66 from different characters' perspectives in 3 different continents and multiple languages, has a relevance for everyone around the world. That's, I think, at least an imprimatur of divinity.
And now, there's other scholars that have similar stories to yours. Lots of people that go down that journey you're talking about end up where you are. One of them is Lee Strobel. I mean, he was skeptical, so he decided to disprove it, and it turns out he followed Christ. But in the midst of that, I know we've all, so many people have read Case for Christ, and in there he talks about how valid and reliable the scriptures are because there's so many ancient manuscripts. And we could go through all that, but how do people dispute the fact that it is the most valid and reliable book in world history?
Well, it's interesting because there's a mixture, actually. And it runs from people who have a willful ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance in a pejorative sense. I mean in the literal sense of when you're ignorant, it means you have no knowledge about something specific. Just like when someone's agnostic, they're claiming to have no knowledge. That's what agnostic actually means about a particular topic, and they're being honest, at least I would hope so, saying, I don't have enough information. But a lot of folks don't have enough information and then go ahead and make conclusions on their lack of information. I recall listening to a podcast, I believe, with the host called the Atheist guy, and he had Bart Ehrman on, and Bart Ehrman is an atheist, really kind of an agnostic, and he's a legitimate biblical scholar. And on the radio program, the atheist guy actually said to Bart Ehrman, well, we know not only the Bible's not reliable, but Jesus didn't really exist, or we have no good evidence that Jesus actually existed. And Bart Ehrman, a fellow skeptic or atheist, said, no, that's too far. We have tons of evidence Jesus existed. He's like, yeah, I know, but the Jesus that we think about nowadays, that's not the same. He's like, no, there's great evidence that there is a Jesus and that he was very similar to what we have today. There are some changes, and so all this. What was happening was one skeptic was making a broad, sweeping statement that another skeptic was saying, hold on a second, you're going too far, man. And I think a lot of times people do that. They go too far based on the information that they think is out there or the lack of it. And I think what's important is what we can do as Christians is actually say, I'm going to offer you some evidence that you have to wrestle with. Does it prove conclusively, without any doubts whatsoever, that the Bible should be the book that becomes your rule for faith and practice? Nothing is conclusive. I mean, theoretically, I could be a very sophisticated robot talking to you guys on the phone right now. Yeah. I could be Ultron or something, right? But
I hope
the
not.
likelihood of that being the case, yeah, I hope not too. But the likelihood of that being the case is really, really low, right? So we can have relative certainty that the Bible is trustworthy because we have that good of evidence that it is. People dispute it, though, because honestly, I think, like me, and I can relate to people like this, like me, they don't want it to be true. And so they'll find reasons for it to be false. But see, there's a difference between being a skeptic and being a cynic. A true skeptic is someone who doesn't believe until there's enough evidence. A cynic is somebody who won't believe even when there is. And for the longest time, I was a cynic when it came to the Bible. I came from a Muslim background where the Quran was God's word and the Bible was not. But then I began to see when my mind was changed from cynicism to skepticism, that led me on a path to belief, actually, because true skepticism looks for answers. Cynicism debunks answers. And I think oftentimes you find challenges to the Bible that are unyielding, not because someone's interested in the evidence, it's because they're interested in an agenda.
Abdu, one of the conundrums I find myself in sometimes is, even though I have answers to questions about the validity and reliability of the Bible, sometimes I encounter situations where I feel like pursuing relationship is more important than correcting a technical truth in the moment. How do you know when to value relationship over answers?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that I look back at my own story and I saw two different ways in which people approached me. One is when they created a relationship with me. Now, I wasn't a cynic that was like one of these sort of angry people who was constantly saying, "Oh yeah, well," and doing that kind of thing. It did happen occasionally, but for the most part, there were people who sometimes responded to me with that attitude, and it was geared me up for a fight as opposed to a conversation. And I think that key element of relationship that you just mentioned is so important because through a relationship, and if you already have one with a cynic or a skeptic, you'll be able to develop this sense of what territory have I gotten myself into. If I got it into a cynicism territory or a skeptical territory, and what answers does this person need? Oftentimes, I found, and I'm telling you, I've seen it happen. It's almost like a Jedi mind trick kind of a thing, but it works because you understand people. I'm moving a Star Wars reference too.
You are so good. How did you do? Okay, carry on. I love it.
I was speaking with someone who's extremely hostile to the Bible. It says it's untrustworthy, it's been changed over time, and you can't believe it, and all these. I have all the arguments and answers, just like you were talking about. But what was funny is that we'd had some discussions over time, but then when something happened in their life that was meaningful, either in a good or in a bad way, something had happened, something terrible, I would bring up a story and say, and I wouldn't even reference it from the Bible necessarily. I'd say, well, think about this. There's this father, and he has this son who walks away from him and says, basically, I wish you were dead, Dad. And I go through the prodigal son story, and you walk through it with them and say, you know who told that story the first time? Jesus told that story. Isn't it interesting how much, and they're like, oh my goodness, that story is so good. That applies so much. And you begin to show them the Bible isn't just relevant because I can prove that it's accurate and true. It's actually relevant because it sticks in our lives. He told the most enduring and best stories that have lasted forever. This Jewish carpenter from some obscure province of the Roman Empire in a small town comes up with the best stories in the history of the world, and we think this book can't be trusted. Oftentimes the relationship leads to it, where you're like, oh my goodness, this book has got something for me. Quick short story, there was one of my professors in school was telling a story. He was an agnostic himself, and he said that he had a friend who was a mental health therapist who helps people get over drug issues. And she always carries a Bible with her. And he says, but you're an agnostic. Why do you carry that around? She goes, I don't believe in this book, but it sure does work. And
wow.
It's just fascinating all by itself. Relationships does yield, I think, to credibility.
But now I can just hear someone saying to the radio, but Abdu Murray, I know you're great with Star Wars and Avengers references. However, I'm a Christian. I believe in truth. If someone speaks a mistruth about the Bible, my duty is to correct it right then and there.
Well, sometimes that could be true, but you can do it gently, and I think you can do it gently and firmly at the same time with the undergoing the art of asking questions. So, for example, if someone says to me, well, you can't trust that book, it's been changed so many times over the thousands of years, my response is, really? Can you tell me more? How do you know that? And because people oftentimes as Christians, and you bring up an excellent point, oftentimes as Christians, because we love the Bible and we want the Bible to be impacting other people's lives as it impacted ours, we feel the need to defend it. Well, there's a rule. As a lawyer, when I was, you're practicing law, one of the first things you learn is about burden of proof. And the burden of proof rests on the person who's making the claim. So if you make a statement, you bear the burden of making the claim. So if someone were to say, well, you can't trust that Bible, well, why not? Or, it's been changed. We know it's been changed. And then ask them, okay, great. How do you know that? I mean, that's quite a statement to make about the world's most famous book. You probably need to back that up, right? I'm assuming you have good reasons for believing that. And then see what they say. Now, sometimes they might give you a litany of things why they think that. Well, excellent. You've done two things now. Either A, if they don't know what they're talking about, you've exposed it in a gentle way, or B, you find out what their biggest hang-ups are, and now you have the information you need to be able to go back to the Lee Strobel books and the other books and say, here's the reasons why I think you might be mistaken about some of that stuff. But you don't have to do it with a, get back heathen, and you throw your Bible at their head or whatever it is. You just, ask a question, and you'll find out just how good is the level of information they have to lodge such an objection. So So the central rule for me is don't bear the burden of proof if you didn't make a claim. If you did make a claim, you bear the burden of proof, but always make sure the burden rests on the right person.
And see, I love watching you and Ravi Zacharias and other scholars in videos online answering people. And I think a lot of people presume the secret to your success is having the answer. But it seems to me the secret to your success is loving and respecting people.
That's exactly right. If we go back to the Bible once again, one of the things that it tells me is, yes, Paul says we destroy lofty arguments. We never destroy people. In Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, he goes to this litany of things our attitude should be when we walk in wisdom toward outsiders. And then he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how to answer each person. A person who objects to the Bible is not a person who has a bunch of objections you need to respond to. Paul doesn't say respond to objections. Paul says respond to each person, because objections don't need answers. People need answers, and they use their objections sometimes to get those answers. And oftentimes, objections are the pointy end of a long spear in the life of somebody that has been hurt, been rejected, or otherwise has a reason. Every objection carries with it some level of baggage. And that person needs to be answered, not a question.
In following the line of respect, so what do you do if none of your explanations work and the person's saying, I just don't want to talk about this anymore? You work with this person, they may be in your family.
Yeah.
How do you respond?
Well, that's a tough one, and certainly I'm actually have gone through some of that in my own life with people I love on various levels. I think that a couple of things. One, we have to recognize something, is people come over time. It took me 9 years to become a Christian, from the time when someone was faithfully witnessing to me to the time when I actually bowed my knee. And part of the reason why it took that long is not because the truth was hard to find. It was because the truth was hard to accept. And there's consequences to it. I don't care what walk of life you come from, whether you're from a Hindu background or a Jewish background or a Muslim background or you're an atheist. There are costs to pay in changing your worldview. And we have to recognize that and realize it's a marathon, not a sprint. So you just nudge gently if you can, seize moments when you can, but nudge gently when you can. And if someone says, you know what, I just won't talk about this anymore, I don't care. I literally had people say, you know what, I agree with everything you're saying now. I see why you believe this and why it's true. I'm just not ready for it. They've literally told me that, or they told me, I don't want this. Well, I can't make you want it. There's nothing to do. Mark chapter 10, the rich young ruler comes to Jesus, and he wants to get justified by his own works. And Jesus points out, you know what, if works was the thing, you're close, but you lack one thing. And it's interesting because the Bible says, and Jesus, loving him, said to him, you lack one thing. And then the guy walked away sad, and Jesus let him. Now, I don't know if the guy came back to faith. I don't know if he did or not. But I do know this. What I do know is that the guy would not give up things, having seen the truth. He walked away sad for a reason. The reason why he walked away sad was not because Jesus didn't agree with him. It's because Jesus pointed out the truth to him, and he didn't want it. And Jesus let him walk away. Wow. Sometimes we have to let that happen, only to allow them maybe the possibility of coming back.
Great stuff. We're almost out of time. Again, Abdu Murray with us, North American Director with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. His latest book is called Saving Truth, Finding Meaning and Clarity. You've got to check it out. Thanks again, Abdu. Always love hanging out with you, bro.
You too. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, hold up. Where are you going? You know you like your time with us. You want more. So look down, hit that button right there, subscribe, and you'll get updated episodes, and then you can hang some more.
And guess what? You can help us. How? A 5-star rating. Not 4, 3, 2, 1. No, 5.
You can also hang with us live, weekdays 6 to 9 a.m. Interact with us, talk with us. Download the Moody Radio app.
Or at brianandjanelle.org.
And we don't put all this together all by ourselves. There's some great people behind all this production. We want to thank Ron Eastwood, Kelly Ryder, Paul Carter, Doug Hayner, and our awesome and fearless leader, Josue Villa.
And finally, this podcast is a production of Moody Radio in Cleveland, a ministry of Moody Bible Institute.
Well, Brian, that's a wrap.
Yep.